Hi guys. Hey. So some of you have seen me here before doing the mindfulness stuff, but I am a professional storyteller in addition. And it's a weird thing to do, to be a professional storyteller, because in many ways it's going all the way back to the days, like the Rome days, right? Where this was how culture was shared. This was how people were taught. This was how stories were passed on, was through just someone saying, once upon a time. Okay, so when I tell stories, I use an old tradition that actually does not come from anywhere close to Rome. It actually comes from the Caribbean island, Haiti. And it goes like this. The storyteller says crick, and the listeners all say crack. So let's try that. Ready? Crick? Crack. Excellent. Okay, so I'm going to start off with that legendary story. And actually, you know what? Could you guys, the purple team, could you do me a favor and just move like 2 seats over, or maybe 3 seats over?
All the way.
Yeah, just all the way down. That way we've got a little bit more of a clump. Okay, awesome. So you know these old stories, including Remus and Romulus, right? All these old stories, there's so many different versions of them, depending on who you talk to and which region you were looking at. And so you'll hear a version coming from me. Some of you who know the story, you will probably know different versions. But let's go. Let's all take a deep breath in. And out. And crick. Crack. Crick. Crack. Once upon a time, there was a king. A good king. A king who was well respected and loved by his people. And this king, everything seemed to be well. He had many sons that would eventually inherit the throne, or at least one of them. And he also had a beautiful daughter. My hair is long. The princess. And everything was in order in his land, except his younger brother. And like so many younger brothers to kings, it was in his bloodline to be royalty, but did he have a chance at the throne? No. Especially with all the sons that his older brother possessed, right? There was no chance he would ever rise to the throne, and he didn't like this. And like many younger brothers to kings, he craved the power and the royalty. He wanted the throne. And so he started to plot and to scheme. He made alliances within the court. He made alliances within the military. And it was only a matter of time until one dark night they rose up and they pulled that king down from his throne and cast him off, exiling him to a far corner of an even further kingdom. And as the younger brother finally got his wish, finally ascended to the throne and grabbed the power for himself, well, now he had the next problem. How is he going to keep the power? Because the people had loved the last king, and they weren't so happy about this change. And so he came down on the people with a heavy hand to make sure that the power would remain his. But the biggest threat of all, he knew, were the sons of the old king. Everyone who was a rightful heir to the throne. So he did what he had to do. Even though they were his own nephews, he had each and every one of them executed. As for the one daughter of the last king, well, that was easier to take care of. He sent her off to a nearby temple, and there she was forced to become one of the priestesses. And as one of the priestesses, she had to remain on her own, single. She could never marry, she could never have a child. Well, thought the new king, her uncle, that takes care of that. But what he didn't bank on were the gods and the goddesses. And being a priestess in the temple, the princess, who was quite beautiful, she took the vision, and she was noticed by the gods up high. In particular, she was noticed by the god of war himself, Mars. And you guys probably know about Greek and Roman stories enough to know that it's not long before the male god comes zooming down to earth, and she was found to be pregnant. Well, not just pregnant, pregnant with twins. Twins that she gave birth to. And can you imagine the controversy? Not just in the temple, but in the town nearby, in the entire kingdom, as it was discovered that one of the priestesses was not only pregnant, but this was the former princess herself. And she claimed that the father was Mars, the god of war. Well, it wasn't long before the rumors reached the palace, and the king heard that his niece, the former princess, had children. Oh my God. He was furious. He was ready to go and kill them right then and there, babies though they were. But he also heard the rumor that these were the children of Mars. You didn't want to mess with the god of war. He didn't even know if it was true, but that wasn't a chance worth taking. And so he was stuck. He wanted to get rid of them. He needed to get rid of these kids, but he couldn't just go and kill them or order his guards to kill them. Unless, what if he just arranged a situation where they didn't kill them, the natural elements killed them? I mean, like, what if those babies just, you know, fell into a river? Then the river killed them. I didn't kill them, my guards didn't kill them. I mean, maybe we put them on the river, but you know, it was the river who really killed them. Then Mars can't blame us. Poisoned, he thought. And so, he sent one of his guards into the temple one night. This guard snuck in by the shadows, picked up those twins sleeping in their cradle, and carried them off to the river. And once he got to the river, well, he looked down at these two babies sleeping so peacefully, just like nose to nose, and his heart broke. How could he do this? How could he cast them into the river? But how could he not? He knew this new king, and he knew that if you disobeyed this new king, then to yourself. And so he was stuck. He came up with a middle path. He found some tar, some pitch, some sticky stuff, and he coated the cradle in it so that it would be watertight and float. And then he placed it on the water and made sure that it was balanced. And with it floating on the surface of the water, he let it go, sending a prayer up to the gods that they watch over these babies and keep them safe. And then, having literally performed his duty, he returned to the palace, hoping for their salvation. Well, his prayers were received. The god of that river, Tiberius, the god heard the prayers and smoothed out the waters, eased the passage so that basket floated safely down the way, floated until about dawn, when some roots, tangled roots from a fig tree that were jutting out into the river, caught the edge of the basket and hooked it into shore. And there, as the dawn came, the babies started to wake, started to cry out of hunger, out of cold. And as they were crying, a mother wolf, lupa in Latin, came down to the river. And she was drinking when she heard the cries of these human children. And she had this built-in instinct to stay away, but even stronger than that was her maternal instinct, because she was a mother wolf. She already had pups back at her den, and she heard these infants crying, unattended, totally vulnerable, and she just couldn't help herself. Her natural fear of humans was pushed to the side, and she walked over to this cradle floating there in the water, these babies crying. And as gently as she could, she lifted them from that cradle and brought each one back to her den. And there they joined the pups in the den, and they started to live alongside of them. She nursed these babies as if they were her own, as if they were her own pups. And these babies grew to toddlers. And once they were crawling around and ready for solid food, well, a woodpecker started to show up at the cave, bringing food for these babies. The woodpecker and the wolf, sacred animals to the god Mars. Accident? Perhaps the father was watching over the children even in this way. And watching over them, those two toddlers grew into children, to boys. And as children, you know, they were boys, and they were wolf boys pretty much. They were wild. They went running around wherever they could. They would roam far in the fields, but they would always come back to the den. And being wolf-like, they were also pretty strong fighters. And they would often fight with each other. I mean, how many of you have brothers or sisters? How many of you ever get into a fight with your brother or sister? I didn't see one hand go down. Okay, there we go. So imagine if not only you're a brother, and a twin brother, so you're like always the same age on top of each other, but you're raised by wolves. You can imagine that your fights might be somewhat intense, and they were. And so it was that one day while they were out far in the fields, they got into a little argument, and the next thing they know, they're rolling around in the dirt, and they're like scratching and biting and hitting each other. And amidst all this commotion, nearby a shepherd was taking care of his sheep, and he heard the screaming of children, and he went over to see what was going on. And by the time he got to them, they'd finished fighting, and they were already just like running around playing with each other like nothing had happened. But he sees these two kids running around, naked, wild, unkempt, making all these crazy noises, not talking like humans. And he can't understand what's going on. But he's a shepherd. He knows how to stay hidden in the bush, how to hide from any wild animals. And so he keeps himself secret so they don't notice him. And in this way, he starts to track them. And he follows and follows, until finally they come into a clearing. And as he peeks between the leaves, he can't believe his eyes. He watches as they just walk right into a pack of wolves, right into their den. And they don't just walk in, but they're welcome. The wolves lick their faces. They go over to the she-wolf and snuggle up with her. What is going on, he thought. But there was another thing in the back of his mind. He, back at his home, had a wife. And him and his wife had wanted children so badly, yet never had they gotten them. They had prayed to the gods, they had made sacrifices, but nothing seemed to work in their favor until perhaps this. Perhaps this was the answer to their prayers. And so he started to follow these boys more and more, taking care of his sheep as he did, but he would track them until he learned their patterns. And slowly, knowing how to very cautiously approach a wild animal, he began to make himself known. Let them see him for a moment, and then he would go. Let them hear him for a moment, then he would go. And so slowly, they started to become familiar with his smell, with his appearance. And he would come closer and closer to them, until one day he brought some delicious food that a wolf just could not provide. And he left it there for those boys. And they came over and they were curious and they ate it and they loved it. And so he started bringing more and more food. And my friends, it was just a matter of time before he had drawn those two children towards him. Kind of like stranger danger, but like it worked out well in this case. Because he lured them with tasty morsels all the way back to his home. And his wife and they took care of these kids as if they were their own, giving them all the comforts, all the most delicious things, so that they would stay at home and not return to the wolf pack. And this way, they started to learn what it was to be a human, how to speak, how to eat at a table, how to wear clothes, how to have a haircut. And they were given names. Remus and
Romulus.
And so these two children grew into young men. And though they became civilized, there was a hint of wildness in their hearts that could never be taken away. They were, after all, raised by wolves in their most formative years. And so, the wildness with which they would go off into the wilderness, roaming far and wide, even while caring for their father's sheep. The wildness with which they would just stand there, like some creature that you didn't want to tangle with. And indeed, the wildness with which they would fight with each other, but also with anyone who crossed them. Just the wrong word and this wolf gaze would come into their eyes and they would just lose all sense of themselves. And they would attack with the viciousness of a pack. And so it was one day that they were out there far off in the wilderness tending to their father's sheep when another group of shepherds, a pretty large group, came wandering by with their own sheep. And you know, sometimes it can get a little competitive amongst the shepherds because everyone's looking for good grazing spots for their own sheep. And this group was so big because they could afford to be. They were the royal shepherds, tending to the sheep of the king himself. Now, of course, this was the king who was Remus and Romulus' uncle, but they had no idea. And the king, of course, had no idea that Remus and Romulus were alive. He was assumed that they were dead a long time ago. He just forgot about that. But these shepherds, being royal shepherds, and being such a bigger group, they started pushing Remus and Romulus around, telling them to get out of there, give them this grazing space. But you didn't do that to Remus and Romulus. And even though they were wildly outnumbered, that didn't stop them. That wolf look came into their eyes, and in seconds, boom, they were on these men, tacking and punching and kicking and scraping and biting. The men didn't know what hit them, but because there were so many of them, they were eventually able to fight off Romulus and grab Remus, pin him down. Well, Romulus had to make a run just to protect himself, and he watched as they grabbed Remus and they dragged him off with him, taking him back all the way to the palace as a prisoner. They shoved him in front of the king's throne, and they told the king some story about how these guys had attacked them out of the blue. And the king, who was a stern, strict ruler, as you heard, he didn't like this kind of behavior. He threw Remus down into the dungeons to keep him, at least as a lesson, for a period of time, as an example to anyone else who messed with the royal shepherds or the royal anything. But back at their home with the shepherds, Romulus was furious. That wolf power did not leave his eyes in just a few seconds. It remained as he had to find a way to save his brother. And so he started to talk with the nearby people, the neighbors, other shepherds, other farmers. And as you got the sense, this guy, the new king, not so new anymore, right? Now in his decades of ruling, he was not the nicest of guys. To kill his own nephews, to force his own brother off the throne. And not just that, but to hold on to his power because he was not so nice. Well, he had this authoritarian edge. He was not liked by the people. They were done with him. And so is Romulus, who came from the royal bloodstock himself. he was a powerful leader. And with his anger, with that wolf-like confidence, people started to flock to him. People started to come to him and hear his call to go to the palace to free his brother Remus, and perhaps in the process, get rid of this horrible king. And so it was that on a night not too different from the night a decade and a half or so ago, longer, 20 years ago, Romulus gathered with a group of men, and they stole into the capital city, and by cover of darkness broke their way into the palace, fought off any guards who got in their way, and in a surprise attack, killed the king and saved Remus. Well, as dawn broke and the king was found lying in a pool of his own blood, the people, at first shocked, then began to rejoice. At last they were free of the tyrant, and many of them remembered the good old days when the old king was there. They knew he had been banished years ago. Perhaps he was still alive. And so the guards who were still loyal to that old king, they sent messengers to the far-off kingdoms where they thought he might be found, and eventually they did find him. An old man at this point, but wise because of his experience and years now, even wiser than before. And he was brought back to the kingdom, and once more he rose to the throne. Well, in the midst of this, of course, Romulus and Remus as well were praised as the heroic victors, the catalyst that changed everything. And people started to connect the dots. I mean, they had this striking resemblance to the old king and his daughter, who was still serving as the priestess. And their age lined up, and the stance, the gait, the power with which they held themselves, the sense of royalty. They started to wonder, were these the grandsons of the old king? And eventually, everyone came to feel like it was so. They were welcomed, Remus and Romulus, by their old grandfather to come and live in the palace. And for a period of time they did. But you know, that call of the wolf was strong in their hearts. And they didn't like being chained up inside a palace, inside a city. They wanted to roam, they wanted to be out, they wanted to be doing. Here they were just sitting. And so finally, they decided enough was enough. They left the palace, they left the capital city, and they started roaming through the countryside once more until they finally made their way back to that spot on the river where the fig tree grew and the roots jutted out, the spot where they were first rescued by the wolf mother. And some deep part of their being resonated with this spot, and they knew this, of all the places they had lived, this was their true home. They looked up, and right there on the banks of that river were two beautiful hills. Perfect place for a small town, perhaps even a big one. And so they decided that they would start their own settlement, their own city. But being brothers, it's hard to come to terms, come to agreement, right? They're always fighting, and sure enough, as they stand there on the riverbank being like, yeah, let's build this here. I think that's a good hill. And Remus was like, psh, that's a terrible hill. We totally want to build on that hill. And Romulus was like, come on, man, what are you talking about? That hill's so like, I don't know, like jutty and ugly and stuff. And Remus is like, whatever, that hill is ridiculous. They go back and forth, and they start fighting with each other until finally the fighting gets so much that they're on the edge of like just breaking out in violence. But Romulus, he pulls back and he says, you know, forget you. You want to build your town on that hill? You go ahead and have fun. I'm going to start on this one. And so he does. He climbs to the top of the hill and he starts digging the trenches. He begins raising the mounds to build the walls, which are the bastion of any city at that time, the walls that would protect the city from invaders. And as he starts building the walls, well, Remus is sitting there over on the other hill, and he's just so angry and so upset that he can't just let it go. He can't just start building his own town. In fact, it doesn't make sense to build another town on the next hill over. It's too close. And he's just watching Romulus working steadily away, getting so annoyed, until finally he does what any brother would do. He goes over and starts giving his brother a hard time. God, that's such a stupid hill. Blah, what are you doing? Come on, that trench is such a joke. And Romulus, you know, he just doesn't want to get involved. He just keeps his head down and he keeps on working, building the walls. But Remus, you know, it doesn't work. He's pushing all of Romulus's buttons and he can't get a rise out of him. And he wants to get a rise out of him. And so he starts yelling at him more and making fun of him more. He starts teasing him about the walls that he's building. And Romulus is getting really upset and really angry, but he's just trying to ignore it. He's just trying to ignore it until finally Remus is like, dude, I'm going to show you how lame your walls are. And he starts running and jumping over the wall, back and forth. And seeing Remus mocking him in this way, after all of this mocking having gone on, he just can't handle it. And that wolf-like rage rises up in his heart, and for a moment he forgets himself. And as he sees a rock lying there on the ground, he grabs that rock, looks up, and as Remus goes leaping over the wall, yet another time, Romulus picks that rock and lets it fly, and Remus sees it coming, but there's nothing he can do, and it hits him in his head, and he falls to the ground. In that instant, the rage leaves Romulus, and he sees his brother laying there still, bleeding, and he runs over to his side. He feels for breath, he feels for pulse, and nothing. Remus is dead, dead by his own hand. How to even describe the pain, the guilt, the shame, the rage that Romulus felt in those moments as it dawned on him what had happened, what he himself had done. Shaking, trembling, he picked up the body of his brother, once so powerful, now still, and he took him over to his hilltop, and he buried him with all the honors he knew how to confer. And with a heart heavy beyond belief, he returned to his own hilltop, and he finished those walls, and he finished the city. And as people started to come to gather underneath him, he rose to power as the king, the only king upon the throne. Romulus's town would come to be known as Rome. Crick?
Crack.
What? It's kind of a tragic story in the end. You know, how many of you are Harry Potter fans or Harry Potter readers? So of course you recognize the name Remus, right? And what was Remus's last name?
Lupin.
Lupin. And of course, Lupin comes from what word in Latin? Wolf. Exactly, the lupa, the female wolf. So Remus Lupin, and obviously it's no accident because what is he? A werewolf, right? So right there, in this super hyper-popular modern-day fiction, we have a bit of Roman history woven in. Remus Lupin, the werewolf. And that's not the only one. I'll give you another quick example from the classical times. This is a Greek story. Tell me if this sounds familiar. A bunch of city-states, there's a war, a number of city-states lose to this one big city-state, and for various reasons, this one big city-state makes all the other losers send a bunch of young people to them. Every year, every 7 years, a period of time, half boys, half girls, and they get thrown into a big, area where certain death awaits them. Does that sound familiar?
Yeah.
Yeah, what story is that? Yeah, so from the Greek times, that's the story of Theseus and Ariadne and the Minotaur, right? Modern times, what story is totally based on that? The Hunger Games. Yeah, Percy Jackson a little bit has mentions of Theseus, of course, right? But the Hunger Games, the entire premise of the Hunger Games is a complete throwback to classical mythology. So there's so many ways in which the stories of old are just being retold nowadays in so many different forms. But there's another way that we see the echo of those old stories, which is in some of the ways that they explain things that we see nowadays. Like, for example, how many of you have ever seen a raven flying around? Of course, what color is a raven? Black. Black. And what sound? Can I hear it, everyone? A rousing rendition of a raven call. Ready, set? Excellent. Okay, so it's got this scratchy, ah kind of noise. So there's an old story that tells us why this is. And so let's finish off with this story. So everyone take a deep breath in. And let it out. And crick. Crack. Crick. Crack. Apollo, god of the sun, would fly through the sky in his blazing chariot of light from east to west every single day. And you can imagine that in the middle of the summertime, blazing as he was and hot in the summer air, high up in the sky, it got a little uncomfortable. And he would be cruising up there, but luckily he had his loyal servant, Corvus the crow. Now Corvus the crow, crows like ravens, nowadays black, scratchy voice, but back then it was totally different. I mean, Apollo not only is the sun god, but also the god of light, the god of truth, the god of music. And so it made sense that his servant Corvus, she was light. She had beautiful white feathers throughout her body, like brilliant white. And not just that, she had the most beautiful singing voice imaginable. Oftentimes, she would just sit on the edge of Apollo's chariot, and he, being the god of music, would appreciate the white of her feathers, the bright of the sun, and her beautiful singing voice. La 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 la. Trust me, it was lovely. So it was that one day Apollo was cruising through the sky. It was the middle of summer, and he was thirsty. It gets hot there in the Mediterranean, and he was just like hot, tired, and thirsty. But luckily, he had this big cup that he called crater. It's like a giant goblet. Like imagine a crater. It's like, it's a god's cup. And he had this huge cup, and it was empty at this point. So he said, "Hey, Corvus, could you take this down to the river, fill it up with some water, and bring it back? I'm so thirsty." And Corvus is like, "Oh, Apollo, no problem, la 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 la." And she takes this giant crater cup and goes flying down towards the nearby river. Well, she's almost at the river when she flies by a fig tree. They like fig trees there. And there was this beautiful fig tree, and it was covered in fruits. Like beautiful, delicious, round figs. And if you've ever eaten a fig right off of the tree, or if you've ever eaten any fruit right off of the tree, it's a special thing. And Corvus, she's been up there singing for Apollo all day. She's a little bit hungry. And so she flies down to this tree and she sees these figs and she's like, "Ooh." And she lands on a branch. She thinks, I'll just have one quick fig and then go off with the water. And she pecks at one of the figs. Oh, but it's almost ripe, but it's just a little bit off. And she's been around the block enough to know that, these figs, with the sun being so hot, it's just going to be a matter of minutes, maybe, before the sun just gets them ripened to that exact perfect place, and she can't help herself. She figures, it'll just be a few seconds, a few minutes, so she stands there in the tree, and she waits, la 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 la. And every now and then she goes over and pecks another fig. Oh, it's so close, but not just yet, and da 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 da. And she waits, and you know that kind of experience where you're like waiting for something, and then after you've waited a little bit, even though the time's getting longer, you've already waited so long that you might as well wait the rest of the time, but now the time's getting long, but you've already put in all this time, it's probably going to be so close, and if she flies away, she's sure that all the other animals are going to come and eat all those figs before she gets a chance, and so she just waits, and the time stretches on. Minutes turn into hours, until finally she pecks, and it's perfect. And you can imagine what before was just a little bit of hunger to eat one fig, having sat there and waited so long staring at these figs that were almost ripe, she was starving. And she just tears into the figs. She starts pecking away, eating as many figs as she can, knowing that this is her one chance at these perfect figs. And she devours them until she could hardly stand up. She is so full. And only then does it dawn on her. Only when the hunger and the craving have passed does she realize, oh no, Apollo. Quickly she grabs Crater, and as quick as she can with such a full stomach, she flies down to the river, fills it up with water, and as she flies back to Apollo, her mind's racing with excuses, with ideas. How can she tell Apollo that she just sat there waiting for figs to become ripe? She's thinking, and finally she thinks up a plan. You know what? A story. So she flies right up to the chariot. And she lands, and immediately she hands Apollo the water, and he's like, as he just waited for her and waited for her. He's so thirsty, but he couldn't leave the chariot, and he was up there alone, and he gulps down that water, and then he looks at Corvus. Trust me, when you get looked at by a god who's enraged, it's not a fun thing. And Corvus, she practically wilts. She's like, "Oh, Apollo, I'm so sorry. I went down, as you said, to the water, but as I was scooping it up, all of a sudden there was this sea serpent who attacked me. He started tearing at me with his claws and his hands and his teeth, and I was so scared. I had to fight him off, and I would have run away, but Apollo, I knew how valuable your water was to you, and so I did what I had to do. I risked my own back feathers." Well, if there's one thing you don't do, it's lie to the God of light, reason, and truth. Apollo knew that every word that she was speaking was a lie. And he just looked at her and he said, if you will blacken your reputation with such lies, then you will keep that on your outside as well. And he looked at her and like a beam of light, power shot from his eyes, and her plumage turned from bright white to the black of night. And as she looked down, she looked up at Apollo, and having lost her white feathers that made her so distinct among the other birds, she started to cry, "Ah! Ah! Ah!" And Apollo said, and if you will ugly your voice with lies, then ugly it will remain. And those cries, "Ah! Ah! Ah!" became her broken voice. Ever since that day, crows, ravens, the like, their feathers black as night, their voice scratchy and broken, we see them flying around. But Corvus herself, she inherited a special fate, to teach her a lesson about storytelling. Apollo took this imaginary sea serpent that she had told about and created it up in the sky out of stars, a long chain of stars that's still up there today. And on the back of that sea serpent, he put his cup crater. And not too far from it, he put Corvus. And since that day, up there in the sky, you can see this drama play out, where Corvus, so thirsty, just as Apollo was, can see craters so close, but every time she tries to come close, the serpent moves. And the cup is always a little bit too far for her to reach. So go up. You'll see it at night. Certain seasons, Corvus is one constellation, Crater is another, and Serpents, the snake, is yet another. All alive still today, going all the way back to the times of the Rome days. Crick! Crack! Yeehaw! Thank you guys for listening to stories told as they were back in the old days. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you enjoy the Rome days. And as you're, is this a competition that they're going to be having?
Oh, yes.
Like a color war type thing?
Yes.
Okay. Don't pull a Romulus. Cool. Okay, bye guys.